Very warm welcome here from the Hamburg Institute for Advanced Study. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Oliver Schmidtke. I normally do these webinars from the University of Victoria. However, I've now the privilege of spending some time here in Hamburg at the HIAS. And I'm very fortunate to be able to use this beautiful venue that they made available to us. Today's event, let me give you a little bit of background, is part of a webinar series entitled European and North American Perspectives on Commemorating and Addressing Past Injustices. And hopefully with our event, we can give you a sense of how a comparative perspective can really add to our understanding of, to put it into a short version, memory politics today. And I would like to thank both the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and the European Union for sponsoring the series of events that we've had until now, and also the research that informs our webinar here today. My special thanks again go to the Hamburg Institute for Advanced Study. They've been great setting us up here and hosting us. And it's also beautiful after months or years of COVID isolation to be here in such close proximity with my colleagues on this panel. So, you know, you will feel maybe a slightly different dynamic than the regular Zoom webinar, although we are joined by some of our colleagues online as well. In my regular ways of introducing such sessions from Victoria, I normally acknowledge that the University of Victoria sits on the territory of the Lekwang-speaking peoples, and that their relationship to the land continues. And with this land acknowledgement in Victoria, we recognize the legacy of colonialism and the treatment of Indigenous peoples in Canada. I'm not sure whether Matt wants to do this in a second. However, you know, now being based in Hamburg, I think an acknowledgement of where we are is in place as well, because the Hamburg Institute for Advanced Study is located in a part of Hamburg, Roterbaum, Grindel quarter, that used to be home to a large Jewish population here in Hamburg. It was actually called Small or Little Jerusalem here. And if you walk the streets here, beautiful streets along these old houses, almost every second house has a plaque, a so-called stumbling stone, a kind of venue that and the plaque that shows you who was a victim of the Nazi regime, what they did, how they ended up. And so it is also, you know, with respect to what used to be the biggest synagogue in northern Germany that was just located a throw stone from here, that the legacy of the past, if you're open-minded and you walk the streets with open eyes, I think you see a lot of, you know, the history that is alive in the architecture and the recognition of those places. So in light of this and recognizing these lieux de mémoire, these sites of commemoration, let me come to the subject of our seminar today, which is that we all share a particular past that is characterized by 20 centuries trauma related to wars, to genocide, to dictatorial regimes. I don't have to make up a very long list, but I think we all realize that our societies still struggle to come to terms with those events and to find appropriate ways of commemorating them and relating them to current social and political realities. So in this respect, you know, our idea here is to show how this, although we have these common reference points, how this form of commemoration often is done through particular national lenses, national contexts that have particular sensitivities, that have a particular culture, that speak to contemporary issues in a very particular way. And I think exploring this will help us to get a better sense of how similar challenges are addressed in different ways in national context. And you know, if there's one thing that we've learned already from working in this Jean Monnet network, is the necessity to be aware that we can't simply take one particular mode of commemoration and adjust and relate it to another context. We have to be sensitive to exactly these kind of circumstances, the cultural context that we're looking into, and think about the particular challenge of post-Soviet regimes dealing with the past of the 20th century. Sometimes for us, let's say from a more Western perspective, it is hard to understand the nuances and the challenges that we are facing. Now, looking at the current context, and I think we go through a fascinating time of reinterpreting this memory of the 20th century, redefining also forms of national identity, and also thinking about how past injustices speak to today's world. And we also see, I think we're quite aware of this, how state-orchestrated attempts are there to give a more heroic and less injustice-sensitive version of what this past is all about. And this is a linkage that we try to address in our network. What is the connection between these past events, the interpretation of the past, and current political and social realities? And we realize that particular actors, be it state actors, be it social movements, they try to use this, because if you think about what our sense of political community, our political vision for the future, they are intimately linked to a particular version of the past. The identity that links past generations with the current one. In a way, these historical narratives are something like cultural material for also political visions in the contemporary world. And in this respect, I think it's fascinating to see how the 20th century is currently reinterpreted and reused also for these political purposes. And that could also take the form of remembering past injustices through a new lens. Social movements can say, look, we haven't been recognized. Think about the legacy of colonialism. We're going to hear from Matt James in a second how this plays out in Canada. France is another example where the bloody war, the Nigerian war, comes up now again, also examining the country's more heroic notion of national identity, who belongs, who doesn't belong. These contemporary realities speak to these past injustices. And maybe just a last note before I turn it over to our panel, was surprising for me as a German who has lived in Canada for so long to realize how over the past 2 or 3 years, issues of colonialism have also entered the scholarly but also the public debate. Germany had a very short but brutal colonial past, but this probably also in light of Germany's gradual transformation to a pluri-ethnic, pluricultural society is now being brought back as a critical reflection also of how Germany defines its national identity, its sense of political community, contemporary dates. So with this, I would like to start our larger panel. We thought we'd do it in a conversational way, have relatively short opening statements, 5 to 8 minutes maximum. And we thought about thinking, as a key issue here. Under what circumstances and through what kind of conditions do sometimes rather isolated scholarly debates about history gain a broader audience? Because we take things in the commemoration of the past often for granted, right? We have historical narratives that are reproduced in museums, but at times, these commemorations or memories are being used, and they are also politicized and they become subject of contestation. So how does it work in national context? Why do they become important, and how? Who are the actors driving this form of memory politics? And with this, I would like to start to invite our, as you can see, we have our panelists here in the room, but we do a truly hybrid format. I would like to invite Matt James from the University of Victoria. Matt James is a colleague of mine, an associate professor in the Department of Political Studies, and has done fabulous work on looking at memory politics of state apologies primarily in the Canadian context. And we thought we'd start here, also challenge our European audience a little bit with a memory politics perspective from Canada, because this is also something that nations want to present themselves in a good light, right? National identity is something to be proud of, and so forth. But I think Canada's self-perception and also outside perception has changed a little bit, and I think there are very serious challenges. And Matt, maybe you can lead us into this a little bit. The floor is all yours, and thank you for getting up so early. So we are aware that bringing people from the west coast of Canada. Many thanks for joining us, Matt.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Oliver, for the gracious invitation and introduction. You'd mentioned land acknowledgements. Yeah, I'll just really quickly, it is something that we're increasingly doing in Canada to recognize that history of dispossession that's happened on this land, and also I think to recognize the continued presence of Indigenous nations on their traditional territories that are in many cases unceded and unsurrendered territories. And so it's a way of thinking about kind of contemporary obligations of redress, restitution, and repair. And so I'm coming to you from unceded Lekwungen territories, 3 different Indigenous groups present here, Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanich First Nations. And just wanted to kind of say that this is Victoria, Southern Vancouver Island here. The talk I have here, it's going to be pretty short and fairly descriptive. I'm calling it Canada from a no-fault culture of redress to the politics of commemorative confrontation. And when I say a no-fault culture of memory and redress, I mean that in Canada, responses to historical injustice have, until very recently, almost entirely ignored questions around perpetrator responsibility and retributive justice. And even in the case of figures who might be long dead, there can be retributive justice simply in the form of naming and shaming and making commemorative moves to name and shame people who once would have been regarded as heroes. But until very recently, there's been nothing of that sort in Canada. No kind of, even in the UK, the Rhodes Must Fall movement, there's been no kind of Canadian equivalent to that until very recently. I could spend all my time just giving examples of what a no-fault culture of redress in Canada looks like, but I'll just give one. And this is the recent Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It reported in 2015, and it was supposed to address the 100-year history in Canada of forcing Indigenous children to attend residential schools where they were taken from their families, taken from their homelands. And the plan of the schools was to forcibly assimilate children, make them unlearn their language, make them disrespect their spiritualities and their parents, in order basically to deculturize Indigenous nations so that they would not be able to resist Canadian incursions on their territories. And that, so in the words of one of the planners of the program, the Indian problem would disappear forever. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in Canada, it was a no-fault commission. It didn't have subpoena powers. It wasn't allowed to make findings of law. It couldn't even accuse individuals of wrongdoing. So the focus instead of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here was simply on the suffering of the children in residential schools, the horrific kinds of abuse they suffered, the consequences that carry on in the form of intergenerational trauma. And as I said, I could give lots of other examples, and not just examples in terms of settler Indigenous relations, but all sorts of Canadian injustice, where there's been certainly talk about the suffering of victims, but no talk about the responsibility of perpetrators. The reasons for this kind of Canadian approach are complex and many. I just kind of flag a few. One is what sometimes is jokingly referred to as Canada's status as a moral superpower. Which is to say that Canadians are kind of used to wagging their fingers at others and strutting around, but not so used to feelings of guilt, shame, and being called to introspect. It's also the timing. I think that the politics of redress and the politics of redressing historical injustice arrived in Canada in the 1990s amidst a kind of worldwide reaction against legalism in transitional justice, against traditional top-down modes of liberal democratic accountability. Instead, the politics of redress arrived in Canada at a kind of moment when trauma culture was beginning to be a thing, restorative justice was beginning to be a thing. And so there was a real focus on voices of survivors and victims, and not so much focus on legalities, forensics, and perpetrators. Indigenous nations in Canada themselves, at the same time, were also focused on healing, rebuilding their communities, and not terribly interested in, the complex details about the specifics of exactly who was responsible for perpetrating the wrongs. And things have stayed like that for a long time. It's interesting to me, I think, to say that things are changing. There is now in Canada a focus on symbolic retribution. There is in Canada a focus on naming and shaming perpetrators, which we see primarily in the dethroning of former heroes, the renaming of government buildings, the renaming of schools, the taking down of statues in many Canadian cities. And these are all, these buildings and these statues, these are all things that commemorate figures who are now associated with white supremacy and Indigenous genocide in this country. And they're being singled out, they're being blamed. And at times, people in the majority society feel the sting of this quite acutely, to see cherished heroes and men whose faces they were used to seeing on the currency suddenly being described as genocide heirs, as perpetrators, as white supremacists. So the no-fault redress culture is eroding, and you wouldn't be surprised to hear this brings with it a fairly predictable backlash, even in the form of white supremacist organizations like the Soldiers of Odin and the Proud Boys, appearing at, when statues are removed, these white supremacist groups show up and try to use the removal as a recruitment opportunity. Right-wing politicians themselves use these controversies over statue removals and building renamings. They use them as fundraising opportunities, mobilization opportunities. They put out petitions with titles like Take Back Canada, Defend Our History, Defend Sir Johnny MacDonald, and so on. And they use that to build membership lists, to get donations, and to kind of build up their bona fides on the right of their political parties. That's about what I have to say. I just kind of conclude by noting a couple of the sources of the shift here. I think the international context is really different now than it was in the 1990s when redress politics came to Canada. It's not a moment where what's dominant is kind of 1990s style South African restorative justice and reconciliation. Instead, the context is almost a kind of global battle, I think, between what David Retton calls the new authoritarianism, right-wing populism, the forces associated with Trump on the one hand, and on the other hand, Black Lives Matter. And I think there is a kind of a global battle between those two forces that very much is putting to the center symbols of white supremacy, and Black Lives Matter around the world have been gunning for those symbols. And I think it's really inspired a new generation of young Canadian memory activists. They're energized by it. Domestically, there's been what public policy scholars would call a focusing event, and that's the discovery of mass graves, 215 approximately children's bodies in a mass grave at the residential school at Kamloops, Tashekwapham, in Kamloops, British Columbia, at a former residential school there, discovered in May 2020. And that led almost immediately to the toppling in Toronto of a statue of Egerton Ryerson, who was a key ideologist of separate colonialism and founder of public education in the province of Ontario. And that toppling of Ryerson's statue by a group of primarily Indigenous and Black Lives Matter protesters, that was followed almost immediately also by a pledge from Ryerson University to change its name. I don't think the forces that are fueling this move to commemorative wars and this move away from a no-fault culture of redress, I don't think these forces are going away. I don't see the dynamic changing anytime soon. And I think it's going to mean Canada kind of joining countries like Australia and Germany that have had more in the way of significant battles over politics of shame, introspection, blaming, and naming. And so, yeah, I'll just leave it there, and thanks for having me.
Thanks very much, Matt. That's a great introduction to the Canadian context. And, maybe let me add one thing. One is Canada as a moral superpower. I'm not sure how serious we are about this, but the other one is it's quite interesting to see that Canada likes to describe itself as a multicultural society, with a great degree of sensitivity to diversity, right? And it's interesting how, in a way, the whole issue of Indigenous rights and the commemoration of their suffering and injustice has been distinct from this legacy, right? It hasn't entered the narrative of Canada as a multicultural nation, its national identity, and that's probably now coming to a different kind of point. And thank you also for reminding us of how, in a way, we see international influences, right? Like the Black Lives Matter movement. I already alluded to the German context. It has repercussions here, revisiting the colonial past, but clearly in the Canadian context, how Indigenous scholars, but also activists, right, use this context for bringing up their cause. So you can see national context, but also this kind of a national environment which enables or gives more authority to some of those voices. So thanks very much, Matt. With this, we move to Dr. Francesca Tortorella, who has a 2019 PhD from the University of Strasbourg in contemporary history, and has now moved on to Lille in France, originally from Italy, and worked on fascism, the legacy of fascism, and post-war Italy. Francesca works on the French context in our Germany network, and she will address some of those aspects related to France. So, Francesca.
Thank you very much, Oliver, and good evening or good morning to everyone. So yes, I will speak about the very complex French memory politics. Vive la République, vive la France. It is the speech's constant conclusion of the President of the French Republic. But what is France? Memory politics contributes to a more general politics that characterizes the nation state as it was conceived in the 19th century, the politics of national identity construction. Like the majority of nation states, France has the great flow of wishing to build a single image of a nation. The dominant discourse since the end of the Second World War is the insistence on France as a cradle of human rights and universalism. Today, we are fully in this discourse that exalts the French Republic and its values of liberty, equality, fraternity, and secularity. It is clear that the recognition of the crimes and horrors of collaborations and Vichy, as well as slavery and colonialism, becomes difficult, since it would be necessary to carry out a memory politics which, instead of celebrating the national greatness, would put forward its errors and horrors, and at the same time would break this national unity. Colonialism and collaborationism do not appear in official political speeches until the 90s. The responsibility of the French state in the Veldiv roundup, and the Shoah is officially recognized in 1995 by President Jacques Chirac. But there is still no consensus on this. When President François Hollande declared that the truth is that this crime was committed in France by France, Henri Guénon, former special advisor to President Sarkozy, it is just an example, declared that France was in London. Behind the denial of French responsibilities, we note an inability to conceive a national plurality. Today, in public debates, we see a resurgence of speeches denying national responsibilities. We can just mention the journalist and guru of the extreme right, Éric Zemmour, a potential candidate for the next presidential election. However, there are also contradictory moments, as the tribute paid by President Macron to Pétain, hero of the First World War, as part of the November 11, 2018 celebration. I think that this is a typical example where history and memory should not be confused. Historians can obviously debate around the figure of Pétain, but memory is something else. In this case, it's homage, There cannot be place to pay national homage to a man who was the architect of collaboration and anti-Semitic deportations, actively participating in the Shoah. Le Statut des Juifs, October 1940. Colonialism and decolonization. It is the other great memory subject in France, and it's even more complex today. The memory not only of the 7 years of the Algerian War, but also the assassination of Ruben Ouniobe in Cameroon, or the 1967 massacre in Guadeloupe, and of numerous other historic events, fell into oblivion. Today, politicians acknowledge some dramatic events of the colonial period. It was Chirac again. In 2005, in Madagascar, he spoke for the first time about abuses of the colonial system. But too often, this speech is ambiguous. Too often, the end of traditional colonial domination has only defined new forms of dominations, justified by a national discourse that does not recognize responsibilities. This leads to gigantic problems in France, with overseas territories that often seem to be excluded from the national memory, and with immigrants from former colonies and French citizens who have origins in ex-colonized countries. But perhaps the major problem is at the international level, the non-transparent relations between France and its ex-colonies, the exploitation of territories, and the maintenance of a system of forces to the detriment of the peoples, especially in Africa, and the support, sometimes barely veiled, of the authoritarian and corrupt ruling classes in former colonies. And when there are corrupts, we must ask ourselves who and where corruptors are. The Burkinabe Rangiwende Ildikó denounced at the last summit Africa-France the devaluing vocabulary about Africa and asked for a healthy, transparent, and consultative cooperation. In other words, partnership, which are not unilateral aids, often tinged with corruption. Collaboration and anti-Semitism, colonialism and racism. It's important to recognize a non-linear history and then a conflictual memory. In this way, it will be possible to create an inclusive and even a European and international memory. Please let me conclude with a memory of the resistance. There's again a desire to underline the greatness of the nation as a whole, but I want to highlight that the greatness of the nation, of the resistance, lies in the choice to resistance, and the choice irreparably split a nation, a continent, and reconciliation does not pass through the region of history. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francesca. And what you can see here in the French case, I think, is fascinating, because you think about France's national identity. It was, in a way, as you just demonstrate, the beacon of enlightenment, of a particular also positive reference to civilization, to political enlightenment and advancement, and all these kind of things. But it's, and the power of national identity is, in a way, not to be discussed, not to be questioned, in a way to be taken for granted. And that has seemingly come to an end when even the president says we need a commission to think about what our national identity is. Right? And I think, as you described, it has to do with how France also evolves and with becoming more diverse, and groups from these former colonies finding their voice. I think that is a way of questioning the status quo that has been basically taken for granted. So I think France is a fascinating example, and also the legacy of collaboration, right? Some countries have, the privilege of redefining themselves as anti-fascist after the war, but this narrative is, maybe slightly too oversimplified in some contexts and too reassuring. But you can see why you try this, right? Because also think about Italy, right? Anti-fascism as a building block for a better republic, but you see it also leaves out things, right?
Yeah.
But we probably can go into more details. Sorry about this, but it was great to hear this. And let's move to my left, your right, probably. Diána Bartha is from the Eötvös, Loránd University, Budapest. I'm not sure how well I pronounce this, so you can correct me here. Diána has a degree in sociology, where she looked at the Hungarian minority in Romania and has now moved on to the second MA. A very busy woman in neuroscience and computer technology, but in our context, she works on the Hungarian context, and I think your presentation will focus on the legacy of the Third Reich and post-cooperation. Am I right? Or kind of. Okay. you would tell me what you focus on. Here you go.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I would like to introduce you how the Hungarian government instrumentalized the Holocaust. And to understand it, I would like to speak about the events of 2014 and a little bit about the circumstances when German soldiers arrived to Hungary in 1944. The events of 2014 was very important because that was the 70th anniversary of the Hungarian Holocaust, and the government, led by Viktor Orbán, erected a monument on a memorial on Liberty Square, Budapest, called the Memorial of the German Occupation of Hungary. So this is interesting because during the Second World War, Hungary was an ally of Germany, and the deportation of Jews and other persecuted groups only started in 1944. But parallelly, we have to know that Hungary was one of the first countries which introduced anti-Jewish laws. The first one was introduced in 1920, called numerus clausus, and this was about the maximalization of the percentage of Jews who could enter to higher studies, higher education. And this law was followed by several more during this period. And it's also important to know that, as I mentioned, the deportation of the Jews started in 1944, but the first mass killing of the Jews happened in 1941, just after Hungary entered the Second World War. And in 1941, almost 20,000 Jews was deported outside of the borders, and German military executed them. So back to 1944. This is the year when German soldiers and officials arrived to Hungary. They were led by Adolf Eichmann, and they were there to coordinate the deportation of the Jews. At that time, we have to know that the Red Army of the Soviet Union was really close to the eastern borders of Hungary. And this happened, like the occupation of Germans happened just after Hungary tried to find a way out of the Second World War. So after the arrival of the Germans, only in 56 days, close to 500,000 Jews and other people from the persecuted groups were deported to Auschwitz, and most of them were killed there. So we can say that without the Hungarian government, without the help of the Hungarian government, civilians and society, it could have not happened so quick. So now we should ask, what is the narrative of the Holocaust of our current government? And I would like to talk a little bit about this monument, which I mentioned earlier, the German occupation, the monument about the German occupation. And we can show a picture for you about this memorial, because it's a highly polemic one. So this monument was erected in 2014. And during the night, without any official ceremony. And it's in the Liberty Square of Budapest, which in itself is really interesting, because we have a statue of Ronald Reagan, we have the US Embassy here, we also have a statue about the Red Army, and this one. So in this memorial, we can see 13 broken columns. And in the center of the picture, we can see like a perfectly shaped archangel of Gabriella. And you cannot see, but the eyes of the angel are closed. And this angel symbolizes Hungary as a victim of the Second World War. And the symbol of the Nazi regime and the Nazi Germany in this picture and in this monument is the eagle, which you can see, which like beats into the flesh and the body of the angel. So the narrative of this monument is definitely that Nazi Germany was the responsible of the deportation and the murder of the Jews and other persecuted groups, while Hungary was innocent, and the Hungarians were victims as well during this this time. So right after the monument was built, like a counter memorial started to appear there, and you can see some part of it. Because of the narrative of this monument, photos of the deported people, deported Jews, pieces of letters, pieces of old newspapers, a mirror, like, I don't know, list of the villages and country cities from where Jews were deported started to appear here. And you can see two chairs as well, which symbolize the dialogue between the two parts. And we used to have like open debate there in 1914 as well. So the counter memorial is permanently changing and developing because people can bring memories there and pieces of that time there. So all of these elements are symbolizing another narrative of the Holocaust. And every tourist or everybody who visits Budapest and visits this monument has to face with these two narratives as well. And this is why we chose this part, or just this statue, because I think it's really nice to demonstrate how Hungarian government uses the memory of Holocaust to its own purposes, but without remembering the loss of the Second World War.
Thank you very much, Diána. It's it's worth noting how the way to frame the memory of the Holocaust is very much an integral part of the nationalist revival, if you want to call it this way, the nationalist way of redefining national identity in certain parts of Europe, right? And how this still is at the core of how this national narrative is developed, right? And I think we will hear more about sites of commemoration, these monuments. I think, Matt, you already indicated, that there was lots of debate in Canada about going there, taking down monuments, right? And here you see again, but fascinating, also a counter movement, right? A counter narrative that is, again, using the site of the commemoration to make, a different version of reality visible. With this, I think we have a very seamless transition to Dr. Alina Cherviatsova, who has been gracious to join us today. Alina, thank you very much. You're joining us from Ghent University, where you spend your Marie Curie Fellowship at the moment. Before, let me introduce you very briefly. You're also Associate Professor for Comparative Public Law, Human Rights, and International Law at the Kharkiv National University in Ukraine. And your focus of research is also, this kind of memory politics and the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and also focusing on sites of commemoration, on monuments. And so thank you very much for joining us today from Belgium, and the floor is all yours.
Many thanks for your invitation, and thank you very much for having me there. I mean, here, there. Today I would like to speak about Russia's memory policy, memorial laws, and European memory wars. We will not speak about Russia's Ukrainian conflict over the history, but we will speak about confrontation between Russian Federation and the Central and Eastern European states regarding history and collective memories. I don't know if you can see my presentation.
I think it will come in a second. We have briefly, it's coming again. So you can slowly start.
Yes. So in European memory wars, Russia finds itself on the defensive. To legitimate geopolitical ambitions in the region, it has to protect the mantle of Europe's liberator. This narrative, let's call this narrative self-glorification, repeat the Soviet concept of history. However, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this narrative was challenged by Central and East European states. In their interpretation, the victory over Nazi Germany didn't bring them freedom, and they were not freed but occupied by the Soviet Union. The former members of the Soviet bloc claim that they are victims of two totalitarian regimes, the two equal evils, Nazism and communism. To protect this historical narrative, a narrative of self-victimization, Central and East European countries have introduced criminal sanctions to ban denial of both Nazi and communist crimes. Can we please move to the several, yes. And now in Europe you have the so-called memory wars. A memory war can be defined as a clash of state-sponsored historical narratives, and we have several states with different interpretations of the same historical events. And these interpretations are not different, they exclude each other. So we have state A, for instance, which promotes historical truth, and this historical truth contradicts the position of state B and can be punishable by the legislation, under its legislation, and vice versa. State B promotes historical truth, which can be punishable under the legislation of state A. So now we have the clash of historical narratives of Central and Eastern European countries and Russian Federation. Central and East European countries promote historical narrative of self-glorification, claiming that they were victims of two totalitarian regimes, Nazism and communism, while Russian Federation claims that it was a liberator of Europe. Next, please. And to promote this historical narrative, Russian Federation introduced Article 354.1, which is called Rehabilitation of Nazism to its criminal court, to introduce criminal responsibility for falsification of history, meaning spreading of knowingly false information on the activities of the Soviet Union during the World War II. This article is used to silence questions about communist crimes, pre-war cooperation between Hitler and Stalin, war crimes committed by the Red Army, or post-war Soviet occupation. In fact, everyone who challenges an official truth of the Russian Federation can be accused of being a Nazi and punished by a hard fine or imprisonment up to 5 years. Next, please. In April 2020, last year, Criminal Court of Russian Federation was amended with Article 243.4 to punish the destruction and damage of Russian and Soviet military graves on the territory of Russian Federation and abroad. There are two interesting things about this article. First, this article has extraterritorial effect. So it's a crime, according to Russian legislation, to damage Russian and Soviet military graves, not only on the territory of the Russian Federation, but outside of the Russian Federation. This is first point. And second interesting thing is that this article was adopted in response to the decision to remove the monument to Marshal Konev in Prague. And this conflict around this monument is a fragment of memory war between the Russian Federation and Czech Republic. For Russia, for Russians, Konev is a symbol of the Great Patriotic War, is a symbol of the victory over Nazi Germany, while many Czechs see him as a symbol of the Soviet occupation. Next, please. In 2020, last year, Russian Federation had constitutional reform. And as a result of the constitutional reform, Article 67.1, which now defines principles of Russia's memory policy, was introduced. According to this article, the Russian Federation is a legal successor of the Soviet Union on the territory of the Soviet Union and in respect to the international organizations and international treaties. Paragraph 2 of this article refers to historically established unity of the state and preservation of memory of ancestors. While paragraph 3 says that Russian Federation respects the memory of the defenders of the fatherland and protects the historical truth. So if to read this article as a whole, it means that Russian Federation is not only a legal, but also a moral and geopolitical successor of the Soviet Union, first thing. Second thing, the name USSR, which was not included in the constitution, now is in the text of the Russia's basic law. And third thing, it means that from 2020, from April 2020, the historical truth whatever it is a constitutional value for Russian Federation to be protected with the use, with different meaning, including the use of criminal sanctions. Next one. This year, there were several amendments to Russia's memorial legislation. Article 354.1 of the Criminal Court Rehabilitation of Nazism was amended, and criminal responsibility to punish disrespect to the days of military glory, as well as insults to the memory of the defenders of the fatherland, and humiliation of the dignity of the veteran of the Great Patriotic War. This article was amendment, so with new criminal sanctions. And to make Russia's position regarding history and its interpretation of the World War II even more clear in response to the narratives of self-victimization which are promoted by Central and East European countries, a law on immortalizing the victory of the Soviet people in the Great Patriotic War was adopted in July 2021. And now it is prohibited to identify the goals and actions of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany in the World War II. And also it's prohibited to deny the decisive role of the Soviet people in defeating Nazi Germany and the humanitarian mission of the Soviet Union during the liberation of European countries. I'm quoting by using words of this legislation. Next, please. Finally, we have to mention here the document which is called the Strategy on National Security of the Russian Federation. This document was signed in force on 2nd July 2021. And according to this document, historical truth and protection of historical truth is among the priorities of Russian Federation. So historical truth is a matter of national security. It's interesting that historical truth is mentioned in different parts of this document in different contexts. For instance, in the context of public security, information security, international stability, and interstate cooperations. To conclude, next please. First, about Russia's memory policy, we can see several tendencies which unlikely be changed in the future. First, Russia promotes a narrative of self-glorification which is based on the Soviet legacies. Second, historical memory and historical truth is a constitutional value for the Russian Federation and a matter of its national security. And third, tendency, Russia's memory policy is getting more and more aggressive as more sanctions, criminal sanctions, to punish and to impose official truth are introduced. So we will have, it means that we will have more conflicts, interstate conflicts and tensions about history, more memory wars between European countries, more violations of free speech, and decline of democracy. And I would like to finish, the next slide, please. And I would like to finish with two quotes which I find highly relevant to our today's conversation. The first belongs to Vladimir Putin. It was published in 2021 in his essay on historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. To better understand the present and look into the future, we must turn to the history. And the second quote is from George Orwell book 1984, which was published in 1949. Who controls the past, controls the future, who controls the present, controls the past. It was a motto of Ministry of Truth. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Alina, very much for this vivid account of Russian memory politics. And thank you for making this link to democracy at the end, right? It seems the regulation of how we speak about and portray the past in the present has a lot to do also with a free public space to debate this very history, right? That states feel threatened by a particular version of the past, that they feel compelled to use the law to control these narratives. I think it speaks a lot about the current state of free speech and democratic culture in those countries. And I think in particular for our North American audience, it's hard to overestimate to what degree Russia in particular is still very much steeped in the memory of the Great Patriotic War, right? The memory of this period of the war, clearly with dramatic events for the Soviet Union at the time, still is a reference point also for how Putin, I think you make this very clear, wants to redefine contemporary Russia, right? And we're only at the beginning of looking at the legacy of Stalin, which is changing as well. I think we would need to get you back here to speak about, the changing memory of the Stalin period and then Stalin itself, but that's a different issue. But you can see here how this memory politics speaks to the core of how Russia wants to present itself, and also how it sees, tries to redefine its national identity. So thanks very much for this, Alina. Greatly appreciate it. For this, we gradually we have two more speakers and three more comments, and then we also leave you, our audience, the ability to come in. You can already use the chat function to put questions or remarks in there that we can draw on in our discussion. But bear with us. I think there's some very interesting perspectives still to come. And the next one comes from Dr. Piotr Oleksy from the Mickiewicz University, where he is an associate professor. And he's also a vivid publicist, a public voice. So when we talk about public history, Piotr is living this as well. And he will speak about, the context in Poland and, in a way, continuing this discussion of the legacy of Soviet rule and the reinvention of national identity after 1989, 1990. Piotr, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Oliver, and thank you, Alina, for the term of European memory wars, because we can say that definitely we can say that Poland is do participate in that European memory war, because historical traumas are the main lenses that our ruling camp used to define our place in Europe and to define our relations with our neighbors. But in the same time, we would have to say that in the same time, there is another memory war that is inside Polish society, yes? inside Polish society. But it was not always been like that, I would say. Yes, I would like to say something quite anecdote that in the beginning of the 90s, my professors discussed the differences between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Of course, there was a lot of differences, but they figured out that one important difference is the role of the history and the memory in the public life. From the Polish perspective, the Western Europe was the area where public life, political dynamics, social dynamics were defined by the questions of economy, of law, of redistribution, of technical questions, etc. In the same time, post-Soviet area and Balkans was the question where people fight about history, where history was a fundament of social movement and about the ethnic and international conflicts. In that time, Poland was somewhere in between, in between. And the funny thing is that we all expected Westernization of Eastern Europe. But we can say what we see is the Orientalization of Western Europe now. But why history and the memory was always very important for Poles, and why we were in between there? Because the society and the elites were really focused on the big national project of joining European Union and NATO. And after that, after joining European Union and NATO, it started to change. The history started to be more and more important in our public life. Somebody said that, in the 90s, we were really focused about securing our future. And after joining EU and NATO, we decided that our future is already secured. And now we have to sort out our history. In that time, right-wing politicians and intellectuals started to promote a historical policy, specific historical policy with the fundamental myth of Warsaw Uprising and of the uprisings as Polish uprising, national uprising in general. And we may say that in the 90s, liberal elites in Poland and in the beginning of 2000s, they tried to develop a Polish patriotism, Polish national identity in the shape of the European memory culture, in the shape of European memory, European patriotism, the kind of civic patriotism. Polish professor Marcin Piotr, he calls it soft patriotism, soft patriotism. And now we see that this approach created some kind of emotional gap, of emotional vacuum. It created a problem of the recognition of ethno-national values, of ethno-national identity, which were quite important to Poles. And right-wing populists used that situation by reshaping that vacuum into the resentment, and they feeded it and transformed that emotions into the question of national dignity, and that is how we are in the place where we are now, so to speak. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Piotr. You probably all realize how this speaks to a very contemporary conflict currently between Europe and the European Union and Poland. And I think kind of what you did underline here is something that was probably underestimated in the European Union, but also in Europe more generally, that you can join the European Union, you take on a legal order, you participate in the wealth, but there is an emotional gap, as you described it. Do we really fully belong? Are we accepted? And what is our role within this huge, European entity called the European Union? Right? And I think this has been underestimated. And clearly in the 90s, it was always taking the Chicago boys. They gave you free market and all those kind of things. But really, the sense of we truly belong. And I still remember these discourses in Poland, right? We are an integral part of Western Europe, right? This was the identity narrative, but it seems no longer to speak to young people. And clearly other offers have been made that are emotionally more appealing, let me put it like this, right? And that is where we're at. And this is the renationalization of discourse, but it fills the void, right? Something that people feel has not been fulfilled by European Union. I'm not sure the European Union is to blame, but clearly, the offers made by, call it the West, right, in terms of integrating post-Soviet states, it's not been sufficient societies, right? And I think what we see is now, why is memory so important? And why does it play such a role in redefining who we are in the present, right? I think that speaks to exactly this sense of we need a stronger sense of identity of belonging here, right? And then that's with this, Piotr, can I turn it over gradually by Birte, who has graciously joined us from Strasbourg, where she is a professor, and she's our partner in the network. She couldn't join us today, but Birte, thank you so much for joining us online. And your specialization in contemporary European history, maybe you can share some of your observations, particularly what you just heard from Piotr, right? That it seems that some countries no longer feel committed to or part of society to this European idea, the narratives that the European Union has to offer in terms of bringing them into a kind of shared, call it European memory, culture, or identity, seem to no longer have this narrative plausibility or attractiveness that some of the nationalist narratives have, right? Maybe you could, reflect on this if you don't mind.
Yes, Oliver, since I have not prepared really a talk about the European memory culture, which is also difficult to do because it's a rather new subject, and we still need some research on this. But I mean, maybe listening to you, I thought the contributions were very interesting. Of course, we can see at the moment that the European Union is again in a sort of crisis. It has been successfully involved in crises. starting with the economic crisis 2008 and then going on with the Brexit. I think a fundamental crisis was also the Brexit crisis, because it kind of led to a disintegration. Now we have Poland, the Polish case, which is putting into question the high authority of the European Court, and this is going against the very fundamentals of the European idea. So we have trouble in the European Union, but the question is, when we talk about memory politics, we can also have trouble in national states. So this does not really avoid us having a common memory culture. So what is this European memory culture? And I've tried to work on this with Philipp Hamann. We had a webinar on the question in this border region where we asked key witnesses on what was their memory, not about war, about the glory of their national states, but what was their memory about the European Union and what this memory culture was all about. And in this border region, it was first and mainly about peace and reconciliation. And I think we can see here some differences with regard to what you have just stressed. The Russian case also is, whereas in others, in national cases, we often have memory politics used in order to affirm the national position, or even, you said, for Russia, it's becoming more aggressive, the national position of a state. Here we have, in the way, the contrary, because it's a community of states, and we are commemorizing not wars or conflict or national strength, but we are commemorizing peace and integration and reconciliation. And you can find this, there are already, when we have started this integration process in 1949, so up until today, we have a lot of, we do have some symbols of this integration. We find them, for example, in the capitals of Europe. You can find them in Strasbourg. If you go to the European institutions, you find a lot of images of the founding fathers of the European Union, Robert Schuman, De Gasperini, Konrad Adenauer. So you have you have some personalities which are commemorated for this. You also find it in bilateral context. You find it between Poland and Germany as a reconciliation process with the Weimar Triangle. You find it early on with France and Germany, Konrad Adenauer, de Gaulle. So this memory politics does not have to be a common European Union. Memory politics can also be something which is celebrated on a bilateral level. France and Germany as the motor of European integration, for example. But the question is, how fragile is this memory politics, and how do you make it compatible with the national memory politics? So if national memory politics is in post-45, for example, of Germany, is also about not commemorating the grandeur of Germany, but about peace and the new Germany and the integration of Germany in the European community, then this goes together. But if you have a crisis and you have a reaffirmation of the national identity, and you have even a repli national, as we would say in France, of closing up again and putting into question the very idea of European integration, then we find signs of this common memory crumbling. And the problem is also that peace was a motive for European integration at the beginning, but now it's more or less taken for granted. And so maybe the founding principles of the European memory politics are no longer so much in the younger generation do not really see them. They don't see the necessity to put an emphasis on peace and on integration. But if you look at, for example, recent crisis, you look, for example, at the COVID-19 crisis. I've worked quite a lot on this in the border context, because one of the ideas of this memory is not only peace, it's also a Europe where you have a common family, we have mobility, you have a free circulation. And suddenly, with the rebordering, you have a question mark on all this. And so you then ask yourself, well, what is this European Union all about? If the mobility in the crisis is put into question, maybe the whole European integration is put into question. As I said to Oliver beforehand, this is all about also the forces of anti-Europeanism, because with the crisis, not only this commemoration of integration is put into question, but Eurosceptical forces, which are growing strong, not only in Central and Eastern Europe, in Poland or in Hungary, but also in founding member states of the European Union. We have to stress this. I mean, in France, we probably will have 2 extreme right-wing political parties for the next presidential elections, and they are not in a commemoration politics of the European integration process. They are all the contrary. So with these political forces take advantage of the European crisis, which we have in history always had, and they have always also had a positive effect of further integration. But whilst waiting for the positive effect, for the moment we see the negative effects, rebordering, we see conflict. We also see a question mark on this idea of that we have succeeded in reconciliation. For example, in the border regions, we had some ressentiment. This was particularly heavy in France and Germany. Poland and Germany was in the border region much more an example of solidarity. And in our border region, we had a lot of ressentiment, a lot of hatred. And in this context, you ask yourself, well, how is this really, can we really still say, okay, we are commemorating the European integration success of the European integration process? So what I would say is that we, in our group, what I find really interesting is if you put the national commemoration and national memory politics next to the European memory politics, how it's kind of, how do we integrate them, the 2 of them? And then we also have to ask a question, because we have also we have today the Russian case. We don't usually in our network we don't deal with the Russian case, but the Russian case is extremely interesting, because Russia, with regard to Europe, has for the moment, I would say, I don't know whether you agree, abandoned its European memory politics. They have turned to a completely national Russian memory politics, whereas at the beginning, when the Soviet Union fell apart and the Russian Federation took the succession, as you've shown with all your articles, the idea of Russia, I mean, they came to Strasbourg, to the Council of Europe, and said, this is the common European home. That was Mikhail Gorbachev who said that in 1989. So the Russians were ready to engage also into a new common into this peace idea and the new common memory policy. But this was, of course, the Council of Europe, not the European Union. We've completely dropped out of this memory politics where we include Russia. So there is a new border, I would say, between to the east, definitely to the east, more than towards countries like Turkey. There's also one. Yeah, I'm finished. And so, in conclusion, I would actually like to ask the Polish members of of our network if they believe that the European memory politics could be for them a solution for their internal crises about situating themselves. Could it be a solution for them to re-engage with this European memory politics of peace and reconciliation in a European family? Is that would that be a solution out of your internal dilemma?
Great, thanks very much, Birte. And lots of things to contemplate here. And I think we need another session for this. A European memory politics, because it is in a way Europe's identity is based on the failure of this nation's member states. Right? It comes out of total disaster and defeat, and the recognition of the fascist takeover of Europe, right? And that is inherently divisive as well between the nations, right? How do you build something new that unites, right? Through actually the division and the responsibility and all this, right? I think that's a conundrum that the European Union has had since its beginning, but I think, can it do without? And that goes back to Piotr's point, right? Without the emotional gap, right? is a European Union more than, oh, we give you whatever billions, right, in terms of COVID response, and that should do it, or is there more of a need for building a supranational identity that can integrate countries in a way, in a different format? You've seen Birte has done already my job, starting the conversation. She has addressed Piotr already directly, while the audience has been so patiently waiting. First of all, you can't clap, but I think it was wonderful to hear from all our speakers here, and now it's for you to engage as well. And while you think, you can probably, we are a well-behaved audience, so I think you can switch on your camera if you'd like and ask a question this way, or you can leave a chat message and then we can read it here. And while you're thinking maybe about a question, or maybe Piotr thinks about the response to Birte, I take the opportunity to introduce our two panelists here tonight, to esteemed members of our Germany network, Ildikó Barna from University in Budapest, where she's a professor for sociology, and Bartha from the Mickiewicz University in Poznan. They've been grateful to say, we step back today, we give maybe our younger scholars a chance to shine. So, but they're very much here with us to discuss. So, is there any question from the audience, or maybe while we wait, Piotr, do you want to address this?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question, and let me answer it this way. When I say in Poland, when I talk to my friends that I am taking a part in the international project on European memory culture, everyone are surprised. So there is something like that. So something like that exists. So I think that in Poland, nobody perceives that there is see any European memory culture, and nobody see any European memory politics. And it is not only because we think that our history is most important. I think that it is because we see history and the memory and the collective memory as a national phenomenon. National, not supranational, not international, as a national phenomenon. And that is my answer. And I have a question to Alina. But
okay. Maybe Beata, but Stephen, do you have a question? Could you wait for one more minute and then we bring you in? Okay, Beata's right in the hot pursuit here from the Polish perspective.
Just to catch your war and to continue. Hello, everybody. I would also say this problem with this European memory in case of Poland is also to explain because of a kind of disappointment in our dialogue, West and Eastern Europe, about the memory, about the common point of memory or common site of memory. Yeah. And the Western Europe stressed very strong Holocaust as a main base of memory, the site of memory. And the idea, the counter-proposal of the Eastern European countries was Gulag, yeah, so as a symbol for communism and communistic regime. And it has not been accepted as our proposition or our point of view to join our perspective of the common memory. And the consequence is a kind of disappointment. If we cannot be accepted with our proposal, yeah, we don't want to create the common European memory and go back to our national position. And it is, of course, very difficult.
Maybe before we come to Stephen and go back to North America in a second, Francesca wants to add one point on the fascism.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just propose you, if in your opinion it's a good point to think about an anti-fascist European memory, because in my opinion, anti-fascism it's really an idea of in everywhere in Europe which divided nations. All the nations in Europe were divided by anti-fascism, and it's not communist, it's not socialist, it's not liberal, it's not Catholic, it's everything. It's really the people who just fight against the totalitarian regimes. And so I think that, for example, because Oliver, before just you speak about the myth of anti-fascism and about Italy. And Gaetano Salvemini, who was an anti-fascist of the first hour in Italy. So in the 1922, when the fascism started in Italy, because well, it's not in 1933 for us. And he was in the United States, and he looked the civil war in Spain. In Spain, there were Italians in Frankists, because Mussolini helped Franco. And then there were volunteers, anti-fascist Italians also, in the Republicans front. And he said, this is true Italy, two different Italy that cannot never speak. But this is also true Europe that can never speak. So for example, I think that the idea of anti-fascism, if we actualize this idea, is the same in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Poland, in Hungary, and in Ukraine too. So,
but not totally the same. The problem is in Eastern Europe, we have both the experience of communism and fascism. So for us, we could say this anti-fascist and anti-communist on the same level. And this is the problem.
Okay, you can see we're going to have a very vivid discussion over a couple of glasses of wine tonight about the anti-fascism, the founding list for the European Union. But Stephen, we kept you waiting, please.
Oh, that's no problem. Greetings from sunny Newfoundland, where it's the middle of the day, thus appointments and things. I'm struck, I haven't necessarily taken in everything because we went from massage therapist to home, and driving was a little distracting, but I've been 50 years in Canada, having grown up before that in the United States, and I'm struck by how much memory has come into play. Matt Janes talked about current issues, white Canadians becoming aware of what Indigenous peoples had been saying all the time in their memories. But Newfoundland is, aside from Quebec, the other nation within Canada with a strong sense of its own quote unquote national identity once independent. And Canadian identity has almost always been in contest between Quebec and a figment of their imagination called Rest of Canada, which to my mind never existed, quite diverse, but contested territory. But I left the United States, apologies, and grew up with what I would have said were settled memories of who the heroes were, and studied Europe and paid not much attention until I was forced to refocus my attention due to a certain former president with, let's say, authoritarian leanings. And I'm struck by how memory again has come into contest. Not only has American history been rethought as we realize what the consequences of race were. Care, please. And it's almost always in contest. One might imagine that somehow in Norway, it's not, but there were those conflicts that Steinroken wrote about. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Steve, for joining us and for your question. I would suggest that we go to two more who have this question, then we come back to the panel. Julia Johnson, I think, wanted to ask a question. Stephen, oh, she left already. Gabriella. Okay, Gabriella, you're next. Back to the west coast of Canada. You have to unmute yourself. Yeah. Perfect.
Thank you, Oliver. I'm Gabriella Hurt. I'm a German living in Canada since 23 years. And I'd like to go back to a point Matt Janes made about Canada's no fault redress culture, and how it is maybe moving more into a blaming and shaming direction like in Germany and Australia. And my question is, are there benefits of, like punishment and holding perpetrators accountable? And what are they? Like, is there a benefit of moving into that direction at all in Canada? Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriella. Oh, we saw a little bit of your art a second ago, but that was Matt, do you want to take this on? Because it is, coming from a German perspective, right? It is, you understand, memory politics goes through stages. It's not like, the development, the different development stages of like a child, but you see, particular focal points in this. And Matt, if you're still with us, do you want to enlighten us what you see maybe as a potential political, if you want to call it this way, benefit or promise in this respect?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Gabriella, for the question. I think the benefits of, I wouldn't say that, the benefits of, I wouldn't say that a memory culture, a redress culture that was focused entirely on questions of retribution and blaming would be a beneficial thing. I think that if you had a memory culture like that, you would have invisibilized victims, anonymous sufferers, and not much attention to their trauma. Instead, you'd have that kind of post-World War II kind of Nuremberg focus on simply identifying a few at the top and maybe ignoring the trauma and misery left in the wake, but that's not the Canadian situation. Listening to everybody today, I was just kind of really struck by the very basic point originally made in a book on political apologies by Melissa Nobles, in which she said that political apologies were all about renegotiating membership. And the reason that nations start re-examining and revising their pasts is because these injustices raise membership questions. And so that apologies are meant to kind of reintegrate victims, acknowledge their pain and suffering, and say, yeah, you are part of us. And listening to everybody here today, I mean, I think that the point can be extended to the politics of memory and commemoration generally. It's all about membership. And when you're at a time of profound political rescaling, because that's what the European Union is definitely about, trying to kind of figure out new balances between the supranational and the national. And the same thing's happening in Canada vis-a-vis Indigenous peoples and settlers. It's a time of political rescaling, rethinking sovereignties and relationships. And so this is going to make memory completely contentious and very, very destabilizing everywhere. Memories are coming into collision with each other. And when relationships are tense and it involves people wanting to leave or contesting a particular kind of political relationship they're in, yeah, there's going to be lots of blaming and it's tough. So sorry, I better circle back to Gabriella. That's just my general observation about the panel, but to circle back to Gabriella's question, the benefit of blaming and shaming perpetrators is to recenter, I think, the moral sensibilities of dominant societies, that people who lack introspection, who have kind of uncritical takes on their heroes, are people that you really can't negotiate with, are people who are going to be unshaken in the sense that their vision of the political community and the relationship is correct. And that's a huge problem when it comes to renegotiating relationships in Canada. So I'll just leave it there. I could go on.
Thank you, Matt. I feel we could go on for much longer, but I'm looking at the watch. We're getting closer. So I would like to invite Ildikó to come in. And then there's one probably last question from Fazila for Francesca and Diána. So Ildikó.
Thank you very much. I just would like to address a little bit this what Birte talked about, this the legacy of communism and fascism. It was a very interesting situation in Hungary when during the first Orban government, they really tried everything to equalize the sins of communism and fascism. The main problem was that they made a day for the victims of the communists, but they also instrumentalized the whole thing. So it was not a real purpose of really commemorating the victims of communism, but instrumentalizing. So the best example is that they made a museum called the House of Terror, which puts side by side Nazism and communism in a very unbalanced way. But moreover, which is very important, and maybe some people don't know because many people heard about the House of Terror, that the museum was inaugurated just before the election, where the opposition was the Socialist Party. So what they wanted is really to make an equal sign between the two and to win the election. They didn't succeed at that time. And nowadays, it comes back when the government, we just made, we have a research center at Alta, Faculty of Social Sciences, called the Research Center of Computational Social Science, and in which we are engaged in is we are analyzing a huge amount of text with computational techniques. And what we found that in the past 3 years, which also included the anniversary or the time when when we commemorated the Holocaust, but the only message Fidesz could send out, it was that the opposition, as they were forced to come together to go against the Orban government, they also included the Jobbik, which was or is, this is debatable, a far-right party. So the only message about the Holocaust in these past 3 years was this, and to make the opposition illegitimate and unacceptable. So that's how the whole thing. So it's a very, very hard issue in Hungary as well.
Thank you very much, Ildikó. Very important point. I think it will stay with us, as we go forward with this network. And I think we have one last question, which is, I think, very appropriate as a last one, directed at Francesca and Diána. Maybe Diána, you could start first asking about in France and Hungary, whether we see some bottom-up memory politics, right? The narrative that challenges is the official one, and that involves younger generations. But I think Matt just described how memory politics has been taken up by young activists in Canada, indigenous, non-indigenous, right? Yeah, they rally around this and breathe, what could be a different kind of Canada, and memory politics is an important component of this. And
yeah, sure. So if we talk about Hungary, we have to say that the media is hugely centralized in our country, and also, for example, the national curriculum. So I don't think that there is too much space to bring another narrative about the Holocaust. But as Ildikó mentioned, the Holocaust not in the focus point, not one of the focus points of the communication of Fidesz, because we saw that the trauma of Trianon is the more important thing in that communication. And about the question of the bottom-up memory politics, I think Budapest is like a good city and a good place to feel that there is a chance about the bottom-up memory politics, and there are good initiatives and alternative foundations. And for example, the Holocaust Memorial Center, which works under the Eötvös Museum, gives us an alternative perspective of the Holocaust. But I think this is only focused on the capital, Budapest, and in the countryside. There is not that much opportunity.
Thank you very much, Diána. Francesca.
Yeah, so I think that there is a great space of debate in France, that the younger generation are sometimes really active in rethink memory. But I think at the same time that the point is, if I use this term, but I don't use this term in a negative way, it's really ignorance, but in a literal way. I mean, I scared that people in France, but in general, they ignore some past and the history. So I think that we speak about memory, but we don't speak about history and about the problem of history. I'm not sure if Madame Wassenberg, for example, I don't know if you agree with me or you have another point of view, but I think that this is really
talking about bottom-up processes in France is really difficult, because France is a centralized state and things are usually top-down. So I agree completely with Francesca.
Thanks.
So, bring this session to a close. Let me thank you, around, the virtual the screens here, the virtual world, sharing these 90 minutes with us. Thank you online, Birte, Alina, and Matt, for coming in and here in the room. Thank you to HIAS again, the Hamburg Institute for Advanced Study, for hosting us today. I feel very fortunate to work with such a fabulous group of scholars, and very much look forward going forward into the future and meeting again over the next 2 years. We will continue this. We're halfway through with our network, and I look very much forward to other occasions to even some of the discussions we started here. And I think if one thing became crystal clear in our discussions tonight is how central memory politics is to what kind of national identities, political visions we develop. In spite of the ignorance that you find among many people about history, it informs our narratives of who we are as a political community. And with this, thank you very much, and goodbye from Hamburg. It's dark by now, so I hope you have a very good start of the day back on the west coast of Canada. Good day.